Hi and welcome to another story, and today we have part 3 of A Bad Spell for the Worst Witch by Jill Murphy, continuing from chapter 6. Cowering beneath the bookcase, Mildred dared not move in case she had begun to be visible again. When you have taken an invisibility potion, you reappear very gradually, head first, followed by the rest of the body. In fact, being invisible is a very odd sensation indeed. Imagine holding out your leg and feeling it with your invisible hand, or being unable to actually see it. For this reason, walking becomes rather a difficult experience, as you can feel your feet moving along, but cannot see where they are going. This means you often find yourself moving in the opposite direction to the one intended, which of course is extremely annoying. Mildred held out her arm to see if it had begun to reappear, but it hadn't. Her patience paid off at last when she heard Miss Harbroom tell the girls to pack up their books, and after much clattering and bustling, the door closed and the laboratory fell silent. Mildred hopped out and looked around. As usual, there was a gap of several inches under the door. In fact, it seemed to be a school speciality that none of the doors fitted properly, and the windows, most of which were slit windows, had no glass in them at all. The whole school seemed to have been designed with the sole purpose of freezing all the pupils to death. Mildred squeezed through the gap and set off as fast as possible along the corridor and down the spiral staircase to the yard. From there she hopped to the pond at the back of the school, for she felt sure that she could hide safely there in the weeds and rushes, while she tried to find some solution to her appalling problem. Sitting on a stone in the middle of the water with a large frog was the large frog that Mildred had often seen, and which had been the inspiration for the tale which had scared Ethel's sister. "Quack," it said, and to Mildred's delight she found that she could understand what the creature meant. It said, "What on earth's the matter with you? Where's the rest of your body?" Mildred realised that her head had reappeared, which must have looked rather alarming, bobbing about all over the place with no body attached. "Don't be afraid," said Mildred. "I've taken an invisibility potion, and I'm just coming back into view. You'll be able to see all of me in a moment." "Where did you get the potion from?" asked the frog, slipping silently from the stone and swimming across to Mildred's head. "Oh dear," said Mildred, "it's a long story. I'm not really a frog at all. I'm a second-year witch at the school, and this beastly girl called Ethel Hallow has changed me into a frog, and I was—" "Good gracious me," exclaimed the frog. "This is quite amazing. I'm not a frog either. I'm a magician. What a wonderful coincidence. I've been here for years, and this is the first conversation I've had with a human for simply ages. How extraordinary. Well, 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 I can scarcely believe it. Allow me to offer you a nice fly from my store." "A fly?" repeated Mildred. "Oh dear," said the frog magician. "Of course, you've only been a frog for a while. A fly, my dear, you know, buzz. They really are quite delicious once you get used to the idea. I nearly starved at first because I couldn't bear the idea of eating, well, insects and the like, but it's amazing what you can get used to." Mildred grimaced. "I'm hoping to be changed back before I get used to it," she said, with considerable spirit, bearing in mind how hopeless she felt. "Tell me how you got here in the first place." "Well, my dear," said the frog magician, settling fatly onto a stone, "it was so long ago that I've almost forgotten. Let me see. Yes, well, in those days, of course, the castle was not a school. It was used for meetings and conferences of magicians. We used to have a lovely do in the summer, like a holiday camp it was. Endless teas and lectures and displays of magic all afternoon. Anyway, to cut a long story short, I had an argument, rather like you did by the sound of it, with a fellow magician, and this was the result. Before I could persuade him to change his mind, the summer was over. Everyone went home and I was left behind. I've been here ever since. I must admit I get very glum sometimes." He breathed a huge sigh and gazed into the dark water. "Why don't you come with me?" said Mildred brightly. "I'm going to find my friend Maud after dark. I know I can find her, make her understand, and then she'll be able to help me. She'll help you too." A large tear splashed from the frog magician's eye. "It's no use," he croaked sadly. "It's got to be a magician who takes off the spell. There aren't any in the school, are there?" "No, there aren't," said Mildred thoughtfully. "All right then. I'll go to find Maud by myself, but I'll come back for you as soon as I'm changed back, and I'll get you to a magician somehow. I won't forget." "You're very kind, my dear. What is your name?" said the frog magician. "Mildred Hubble," replied Mildred. "What's yours?" "Algernon, something or other, Webb." "Isn't that awful?" said the frog magician. "Do you know, I can't remember the first bit. I've been here so long. What was it now? Bowen Webb? Stone Webb? Or was it Webley Stone? I'm sorry, child, I've completely forgotten. Oh dear, it was all so very long ago. I must say sometimes I'd give anything to have a proper old-fashioned tea again. One gets so fed up with flies and water boatmen. Every now and then I can see it all so clearly. A nice log fire and a little round table with a tablecloth, and hot toast with great slabs of butter, and crumpets with honey all oozing out of the little holes, and a china cup with steaming tea." The memory was too much for him, and he erupted into loud, desperate sobs, a pitiful sound to hear. Mildred hopped next to him and patted him with a half-visible arm. "Don't cry, Mr. Algernon, sir," she said comfortingly. "You shall have crumpets for tea again. Don't you worry. It'll be all right. I promise it will. Chapter 7. Night had fallen and the pupils of the academy were all in bed. That is to say, most of the pupils were in bed. Enid had sneaked into Maud's room for a quick conference about Mildred. It was bitterly cold in the cell-like bedroom, and the two girls were huddled on the bed, wrapped in blankets with cats draped over their feet to keep out the cold. Maud was taking care of Mildred's tabby. "Well, I give up," said Enid. "If she has run away, she's left every single piece of clothing behind, even her cardigan, so she must be frozen solid by now." "She hasn't run away," said Maud. "She wouldn't have gone just because HB told her off. Anyway, she's not likely to have run away without old Tabby here, especially as that was why HB was cross in the first place. It just doesn't make sense. No, I'm quite sure that Ethel knows something about it. Don't you remember what she said to Mildred? No one insults my family and gets away with it. Well, I think she's done something really awful to Mildred." "Like what?" asked Enid. Just at that moment the cats all leapt to their feet with their fur on end and looked in the direction of the door. The girls exchanged nervous glances, thinking that it must be Miss Hardbroom, come to reprimand them for being out of bed. Maud crept to the door and opened it very slowly. Outside in the shadowy corridor was the little frog which had escaped from the potion laboratory. Maud and Enid could tell it was the same one because its feet had not yet reappeared. Mildred hopped inside and was picked up by Maud, who took her over to Enid. Tabby immediately began nuzzling up against the frog in a very friendly way, unlike the other two cats who kept in the background, backs arched and humming frantically. "How strange, Enid," said Maud. "Look at Tabby. It seems as if they've met before." The two witches suddenly looked at each other in horror. "Oh no!" they exclaimed at the same time. "It can't be," gasped Maud. "Or can it?" "I think it might be," replied Enid grimly. She took the frog from Maud and held it up near to her face. "Are you—" she began, but before she could finish, the little frog was leaping up and down, nodding its head and croaking so loudly that the girls were afraid someone would hear. "Shh," whispered Enid. "Calm down, for goodness sake. Now then, are you our very good friend Mildred Hubble?" There was no doubt about it from the nodding and mad capering that here was the answer to Mildred's sudden disappearance. "Did Ethel do it?" asked Maud. More nodding and croaking was the answer. "Right," said Maud. "Come on, Enid." Ethel was not asleep either. She was sitting up in bed learning the chant which was to be tested the next day. She nearly leapt through the ceiling when the door opened and Maud and Enid marched menacingly into the room. "Recognise this?" asked Maud, holding out the frog. "Remind you of anyone, does it?" Ethel turned as white as a sheet. I don't know what you're talking about," she said. "All right," said Maud. "Then we're off to Miss Hardbroom. Come on, Enid. Sorry to have bothered you, Ethel." "No," cried Ethel. "It's Mildred, isn't it? Oh, thank goodness you found her. I didn't mean to run off and get lost. I just wanted to give her a fright, that's all." "Come here and let me take off the spell." "Hold on a moment," said Enid. "I think we'd better get Miss Hardbroom. I mean, how are we going to explain where Mildred's been?" "Let's tell her in the morning," wheedled Ethel. "She'll be in a dreadful mood if we disturb her tonight. Anyway, I'm sure poor Mildred can't wait a moment longer." Ethel spoke the words of the spell, and at once Mildred was standing before them. "Thanks for nothing, Ethel Hallow," she said, rubbing her arms and legs. "Gosh, it feels really odd to be this big again. Oh, Maud, it was so awful in the potion lab, I really thought I'd had it." The door opened like a thunderclap, and there stood Miss Hardbroom. "Having a nice little party, are we, girls?" she inquired dryly. "Ah, Mildred, I see you've decided to rejoin us at last. We hope you have had a pleasant time wherever you have been. Would it be too much, perhaps, to inquire exactly where you have been, The three friends looked desperately at Ethel, who stepped forward with a smirk flickering at the corners of her mouth. "I caught Mildred creeping down the corridor with Maud and Enid here," she said innocently, "so I admitted them into my room, and I was just coming to fetch you, Miss Hardbroom." "Ethel!" exclaimed Maud, Enid and Mildred together. "That's not true, Miss Hardbroom," squeaked Mildred indignantly. "Ethel turned me into a frog, and that's where I've been for the last day, and it was her fault. She's only just changed me back." "I did not," lied Ethel, sounding convincingly angry. "I wouldn't do such a thing, unlike some people around here," she added under her breath, referring to the time when Mildred had accidentally changed Ethel into a pig during their first term at the school. "Mildred," said Miss Hardbroom, "you will write out 500 times in perfect handwriting. I must learn to curb my imagination and to—" "Good gracious, girl, what on earth has happened to your feet?" They all looked and saw that Mildred's feet, still recovering from the invisibility potion, had not yet reappeared, even though she had changed back to her usual self. "That proves it!" exclaimed Mildred joyfully. "Miss Hardbroom, I was the frog in the potion laboratory, the one you found in the corridor, and the potion I took is only just wearing off. That's why I haven't any feet at the moment. Oh yes, and to prove it even more, I can tell you that you have a handkerchief, a whistle, and a notebook with a rubber band around it in your pocket." Miss Hardbroom turned to Ethel. "Well?" she asked in tones so terrifying that all four of her pupils shrank back against the wall. She had insulted my family, Miss Hardbroom, said Ethel feebly, and I really didn't mean her to run off like that. I only meant to give her a scare. I didn't mean—" She trailed into silence. "Ethel, Mildred," said Miss Hardbroom, "you will both come to my room first thing in the morning before breakfast. Now get along to bed at once, all of you." Their form mistress ushered the three friends to their separate rooms. Mildred's room was the last of all. "Let us hope that your feet are in the correct place by the morning, Mildred," said Miss Hardbroom frostily, as Mildred hastened inside and closed the door. Chapter 8. Shortly after the rising bell had been rung, Ethel and Mildred were waiting anxiously outside Miss Hardbroom's door. It was the first time that Ethel had been summoned to her form mistress for any reason other than praise. "It's your fault, Mildred Hubble," she muttered, as they paced up and down the corridor. "If you hadn't told that stupid story to Sybil and upset her, I wouldn't have done it to you. Anyway, I really was going to take the spell off straight away, but of course you have to go hopping off and get caught and land us in this mess." "You've got a nerve, Ethel Hallow," said Mildred. "You just can't ever admit you might be wrong, can you? It wasn't exactly fun being pursued around the potion lab and shoved into jars. It wouldn't occur to you that—" The door opened, and Miss Hardbroom beckoned them inside. "Sit," she barked, indicating two chairs opposite her desk. They all sat down. "It wasn't my fault, Miss Hardbroom," Ethel blurted out. "Mildred Hubble told my little sister this story about first years being changed into frogs by the teachers. She even told Sybil that the frog in the school pond was enchanted, and poor Sybil was in such a state that I thought someone ought to teach Mildred a lesson." "It wasn't exactly like that, Miss Hardbroom," said Mildred. "I'd gone up to Ethel's sister to cheer her up, because she was looking so miserable. I didn't know—" "I have heard quite enough excuses," interrupted Miss Hardbroom, "and I do not wish to hear any more. Frankly, I am not in the least bit interested in whose fault the incident was. The reason I have called you both here is to remind you that you are now second-year witches, and I do not expect this ridiculous feud between you two girls to continue. Do you understand?" "Yes, Miss Hardbroom," replied Ethel and Mildred meekly. "Ethel," continued Miss Hardbroom, "just because you happen to be an excellent scholar and one of the most helpful members of my class, I do not expect you to lie your way out of a situation when it has become awkward. Do you understand this?" "Yes, Miss Hardbroom," said Ethel. "Neither," said Miss Hardbroom, "do I expect you to contravene the Witches' Code, Rule number 7, paragraph 2, by changing your fellows into any sort of animal for whatever reason. Do you understand that?" "Yes, Miss Hardbroom," said Ethel. "Good," said Miss Hardbroom. "Then you will understand why I am giving you 100 lines, which will say I must tell the truth at all times." She turned her attention to Mildred. "Mildred, I would ask you to refrain from tormenting the first years with untrue horror stories about the academy, and to make some attempt to think, if that is possible, before you embark upon any more madcap escapades." "Yes," Miss Hardbroom replied at Mildred. "Oh, and Miss Hardbroom, I've just remembered. There is a frog in the pond, and it really is someone under enchantment. I know it sounds like another made-up story." "Mildred Hubble," said Miss Hardbroom wearily, "what have I just said to you?" No, don't attempt to answer. I expect you've completely forgotten already, haven't you? Sometimes I feel that any attempt to communicate with you is an utter waste of time. Now, I've said all that I wish to say to the girls, except, Mildred, that you will write 100 lines which will say, I must try very hard not to be quite so silly. Now hurry along to breakfast, girls. That will be all." Mildred was now faced with the impossible task of convincing someone that there was an elderly magician in the pond. She tried to tell Maud and Enid, but they had had enough of frog stories, particularly as Mildred had actually admitted to them, at the time, that the story she had told Sybil was not true. It seemed quite hopeless. The only way of getting to a magician was at the celebrations on Halloween night, but after the broomstick display, which Mildred had ruined the year before, she felt very worried about creating any more havoc in that direction. Mildred spent a lot of time by the pond telling the frog magician that she hadn't forgotten him and that she would get him out if it was the last thing she did. He always kept a distance from her, but she felt sure he knew who she was. Looking at his froggy face, half submerged in the murky water, it was hard to believe that he really was anything more than an ordinary frog, and Mildred could see why no one had recognised her when she was in the same plight. And that is where we will leave part 3 of A Bad Spell for the Worst Witch by Jill Murphy. I'll be back soon with a final part of this fantastic little story, and lots more stories and videos coming your way very soon. If you'd like to subscribe or hit a like, that's always appreciated. Thanks for listening, guys. Goodbye.